Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Isabel Lilias and I'm one of the Ath Fellows this year. Imagine entering a small suburban town existing in the same time and only 15 miles from a bustling city that looked like it was from a completely different century. Imagine the residents of this town not speaking in a language that you understand, and imagine them not being able to understand you. Imagine a community where majority lives below the poverty line, but there is no homelessness. Imagine a community that operates on a completely different legal system, yet is able to abide by the laws of a greater federal system. Imagine a town housed in the United States that forgoes the separation of church and state. What if I told you that there is a town in suburban New York that fits this description? Our speaker tonight will explore the curious case of Kiryas Joel and discuss whether this community's existence is consistent with or a deviation from the American legal and political tradition. David Myers is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA and is serving as the inaugural director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He is also president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History in New York City. An alumnus of Yale College, David Myers completed his undergraduate studies at Tel Aviv and Harvard universities before receiving his PhD with distinction in Jewish history from Columbia University. David Myers has written widely in the fields of Jewish intellectual and cultural history. His books include Reinventing the Jewish Past, Resisting History, The Crisis of Historicism in German Jewish Thought, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Rowidowicz, and Jewish History, a very short introduction. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time, and please join me in welcoming David Myers to the Athenaeum.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I am really delighted to be here with you. I have long heard of the actual existence of this extraordinary intellectual forum, and it's really a great, great delight to be a participant in it. There was some last-minute discussion about which talk I would actually be giving, which may explain why I think we may have the wrong PowerPoint up here. We are not, as far as I know, at Tel Aviv University, but rather Claremont McKenna College. So I hope that this actually will be close enough to the PowerPoint that I plan to offer you and isn't too much oriented towards my Israeli colleagues in political science. What I do want to talk to you about is really a remarkable phenomenon in both Jewish and American history, and that is the case of Kiryas Joel, New York, which is, as we can see here, a legally recognized village in the state of New York. It's a community that currently numbers about 22,000 people. One of the distinguishing features of this community is that it has the highest birth rate of any community in the state of New York, and doubles in population every decade. I think this is the wrong PowerPoint, but okay. What's distinctive about this community is that it's comprised almost entirely of members of one Hasidic group. The term Hasidism or Hasidim, those terms refer to a group of traditionally observant Jews who adhere to a particular set of ritual practices and beliefs that separated them from other traditionally observant Jews. And amongst the distinguishing characteristics of Hasidim were their commitment to an ethos of enthusiasm in prayer, a commitment to practice as opposed to study as the central normative animating feature of one's Judaism, a belief in the existence of God in the world around us, such that one communes with God by engaging actively and enthusiastically in whatever one does. So eating, singing, and praying were all in a certain sense equivalent acts that reflect the unique spirit of this pietist movement that arose in the latter half of the 18th century in Eastern Europe. The movement began as one or two cells and then branched out into many different courts, as they were known, because each of these courts had at its center a particularly charismatic leader known as the Rebbe, who was deemed in Hasidic ideology a tzaddik, a saintly person. And in fact, Hasidism advances the ideal, unknown to other more traditional Orthodox groups, of the tzaddik or Rebbe as the intermediary between human and divine realms. Which is why opponents of Hasidism, who were called mitnagdim, namely opponents, referred to Hasidism as a form of Christianity by thinking of that tzaddik who was an intermediary between human and divine realms and thus approximate in the eyes of the enemies none other than Jesus. What's interesting about Kiryas Joel, New York, is it's made up almost exclusively of members of one Hasidic court, the Satmar Hasidic court, which we will talk about in a bit. And what's even more interesting about this community, which is markedly homogeneous, is the fact that it represents what I call a form of local sovereignty. Otherwise, we might refer to this as a strong, very strong form of communal autonomy. And I say that because the community, as we will see, is a legally recognized village in the state of New York, consisting entirely of members of one traditional separatist religious group, which would see on the face of it to be a violation of the vaunted principle of a separation of church and state. This community of Kiryas Joel, New York, is about 50 miles due north of New York City in Orange County, and it is a village that operates under the aegis of the town of Monroe, a town of about 35,000 or so residents. So Kiryas Joel represents a very large majority within the town of Monroe. Its location we can talk about a little bit later, but I do want to say that it was planned to be far enough away from New York City to be able to resist the seductions and allures of a teeming multi-ethnic urban environment, which was deemed injurious or deleterious to this community of traditionalist Jews, but close enough for a daily commute for economic purposes. So it had to sort of strike this balance between being far enough away and yet close enough. All right, so what do I mean by local sovereignty, which is the term I use to describe Kiryas Joel? Well, the term sovereignty in its modern incarnation, I think, can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia that brought to an end the 30 Years' War, the highly fractious and destructive 30 Years' War, out of which emerged the notion of state-based sovereignty, the notion of authority being vested in a political state. And this is indeed what we often assume to be the regnant notion of sovereignty when we use that term, referring back to the power and authority inhering in a state. I think it's important to note that sovereignty was the desired goal of many nationalist movements, especially in the 19th century, which is, to a great extent, the century of nationalism, the age of nationalism. But it's important to note at the same time that sovereignty was not the only desired goal of nationalists. There were other nationalist traditions that didn't imagine that the group that they represented would eventuate in a sovereign state. There's a tradition, especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century, of non-statist nationalism, which was an ideal expressed by groups that understood that they were highly unlikely ever to receive the vestiges of state sovereignty. And instead, they fix their sights on, in a certain sense, a lower form of sovereignty, namely cultural autonomy. The idea was that within an existing state or imperial structure, that group, recognized as a nation, should have autonomy over its educational, cultural, and linguistic affairs. And this is something that Jewish groups actively sought to achieve in a period of very considerable activity in the late 19th and early 20th century, a period of considerable nationalist activity. What do I mean by that? Jews began to develop the language of the day, the regnant language of the day, nationalism, and assert that we too are nations. We too are a nation. That is to say, we who have often thought of ourselves as members of a religious group are now beginning to define ourselves as a nation. But curiously, not all Jewish nationalists believed that the ultimate goal was the creation of a political state. Some believed that the ultimate goal was the creation of national cultural autonomy. So we should bear that in mind. In our current age, once upon a time, I believed, not too long ago, maybe 2 years ago, that forces of globalization were going to erode the boundaries of state-based sovereignty. Powerful forces of economic globalization and, in their wake, cultural globalization would erode the boundaries of state-based sovereignty and lead to lesser forms, weaker forms of authority that might recall the late 19th century era of national cultural autonomy. But in fact, what we've seen over the last couple of years is a resurgence of a kind of very strong sovereignty-based nationalism that's very clearly a pushback against the boundary-crossing forces of globalization. So it's not actually clear whether we're seeing the erosion of statist sovereignty as we might have predicted a mere 2 years ago. Nonetheless, what we're talking about here is a form of sovereignty, a strong form of autonomy that takes rise from the bottom up. It's not imposed from the state, but really took rise from the bottom up, is a manifestation of what I call communitarianism from the bottom up. And that's the case that I want to explore with you tonight of Kiryas Joel, which, as I say in the bottom of this slide, made a transition from a Shtetl, which is the Yiddish term for a small town, to a village. And I'll explain why that language is significant in just a minute. The person who animated the creation of this community was the founding rabbi or rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, a man by the name of Joel Teitelbaum, who was the scion of an illustrious Hasidic family from northeast Hungary, whose family was really notable not only for its extraordinary piety and for its commitment to Torah, traditional classical Jewish learning, but also for its combative quality, its commitment to fight for the ideals which it regarded as essential to the preservation of a Torah-true Judaism. So this was not a family noted for its quietism. It was a family noted for its combative, even we might say martial spirit. The language used in this family is often of a war for the Torah, language which is not unknown in the history of rabbinic literature. Now, one might assume that that combative or martial quality would lead to the most politically advanced form of nationalism. But in fact, nothing could be more to the contrary. Another distinguishing mark of Rabbi Teitelbaum and his successors was a ferocious opposition to that form of state-based nationalism known as Zionism. Zionism was the Jewish nationalist movement that planned and sought to return the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland in the land of Israel. Rabbi Teitelbaum was ferociously opposed to Zionism because he believed that it was an instance of human beings arrogating to themselves the right that was only God's. It was only a matter of divine prerogative for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland, and to do so via the vehicle of the Messiah. Zionists who began to call for a return of the Jews to their homeland were, in a sense, taking upon themselves what was God's responsibility. And Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum and a number of other traditionally Orthodox and often Hasidic Jews developed a fierce opposition to Zionism. In fact, I would say that Rabbi Teitelbaum was probably the most significant Jewish anti-Zionist of the 20th century. He wrote about it frequently and agitated against it often. Now, having said that, what's interesting about Rabbi Teitelbaum, who was born and raised in Hungary, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the end of the First World War, is that his battle against Zionism was so constitutive, I would suggest, that he developed a kind of inarticulate idea of creating a counter-Zion, of creating a place other than in the land of Israel, where Jews could congregate and develop a community that lived according to the ideals of what he saw as Torah true Judaism. That counter-Zionist vision was not realized for him in Europe. It couldn't be. He served as chief rabbi in the town of Satmar, the Hungarian town of Satmar, which after 1920 became the Romanian town of Satu Mare. He served as chief rabbi from 1934 until 1944. And as I was talking with, I think it was Lauren, about her interest in the Holocaust in Hungary, Hungarian Jews thought in the first months of 1944, certainly 1943, that in a certain sense the verdict of death that had befallen so many other Jews in East and East Central Europe had escaped them. But then in the middle of March 1944, the arrangement that Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian leader, had brokered with Adolf Hitler collapsed, and German and Nazi forces entered Hungary, and within a few short months had deported a staggeringly large portion of the population of Hungarian Jewry. This brought to an end Hungarian Jewry as we know it. It brought to an end Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum's attempt to create a Torah true community in Hungary. He was saved as part of a transport of 1,700 Jews whose safe passage was assured by virtue of an arrangement brokered by a Hungarian Zionist official and none other than Adolf Eichmann. And he made his way in this transport first to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, and then in December 1944 to Switzerland, where he lived for less than a year before making his way to the land of Israel. Interestingly, although his anti-Zionism was deeply confirmed, and although he would be unequivocally opposed to the creation of a Jewish state, he nonetheless felt it necessary to go to the land of Israel, to see what was going on there, to build up institutions. Around the September 1946, the Jewish New Year, he came to the United States to raise money for his institutions, his fledgling institutions in Jerusalem, and ended up staying here for the rest of his life. He made his way, shortly after arriving in the United States, to Brooklyn, New York, which was in the midst of a very considerable transition, as Brooklyn is today, also in the midst of very considerable transition. Brooklyn was beginning in 1946, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, beginning to become a major home for traditionally observant Orthodox Jews. There was a substantial minority of Orthodox Jews in various neighborhoods in Brooklyn, but what happened over the course of the next couple of decades was whole neighborhoods of Brooklyn became overwhelmingly Orthodox, especially as Holocaust survivors made their way to the United States. And in fact, that's what happened with Rabbi Teitelbaum. He made his way to Brooklyn with no more than a few dozen followers. Many Holocaust survivors, often from Hungary, came to the United States, heard about Rabbi Teitelbaum, who was a charismatic man, and began to assemble around him. And his community grew from a couple of dozen in the late 1940s to thousands by the early 1960s. Interestingly, he settled in Brooklyn, which was at some level a curious place to make one's home if one was committed, as he was, to, in a certain sense, in a certain very real sense, living apart from the rest of the world. It was hard to do in Brooklyn, which was as I said, a teeming urban environment marked by many different cultural and ethnic groups. So almost immediately upon making his way to Brooklyn in 1946, Rabbi Teitelbaum told his close associates, I want to find a place for the community that will arise outside of New York, which will be a kind of place of refuge, at a remove from the city. It was that ideal of a community beyond Brooklyn that he referred to as a Shtetl, the Yiddish term for a small town, usually associated with, at least in sort of the romanticized vision of Fiddler on the Roof, as entirely comprised of Jews. Turns out that the Shtetls of actual historical existence were never, or very rarely, entirely Jewish. That was a kind of romanticized ideal of a fiddler on the roof. Ironically enough, the Shtetl that Rabbi Teitelbaum would go on to create fit the romanticized model much more than the actual historical examples that we can point to. In calling for the creation of this Shtetl, already in the late 1940s, in a certain sense, Rabbi Teitelbaum was manifesting in the first instance his own Americanization, because this also belonged to the great post-war movement of suburbanization that would be such a powerful force in population distribution over the course of the 1950s. Here we see a Hebrew book written by a disciple of Rabbi Teitelbaum called Ratzon Tzaddik, which means the will of the saintly leader, which describes the creation of the community that would come to be named after Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, Kiryas Joel, the village of Joel. It laid out his ideal of a shtetl as a place of purity. And indeed, we should call attention to the recurrent language of purity in Rabbi Teitelbaum's rhetoric. There's a recurrent call to create an environment of purity, unpolluted by the contaminants of society, which is very much characteristic of the language that informs the creation of enclave societies, as studied by anthropologists like Mary Douglas and others. What Rabbi Teitelbaum wanted to create, as described by this historian, this Satmar historian about whom I can tell you, because he became a friend of mine, a historian within the community, a chronicler of basically every minute in the life of Rabbi Teitelbaum. He not only wrote a book about Kiryas Joel, the book you see before you, but he wrote now a 10-volume biography of Rabbi Teitelbaum. What he wanted to create, Rabbi Teitelbaum, was a place of purity that would be a kind of oasis of cultural autonomy. He didn't aspire to assume the mantle of governmental authority. Rather, he wanted a place of cultural autonomy segregated from the rest of society, where Satmar Jews could live their life according to their unique precepts. And attempts were made over the course of the 50s and 60s to find an appropriate venue. Here you see before you a newspaper article from 1963, which reflects the efforts of Satmar Hasidim to buy land in New Jersey. There were other attempts in New York that took place throughout the 1960s. And what the Satmar Hasidim often found was a decidedly inhospitable reception when they came to a particular locale. Turns out that many newly transplanted suburbanites, and remember that the suburbs are, at least in the 50s and 60s, very often a site of very considerable racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic segregation in and of themselves. Suburbanites weren't thrilled at the prospect of scores or hundreds of foreign-looking Hasidic Jews moving into their neighborhood. So it was not easy to buy land, and disputes arose as took place in Mount Olive, New Jersey in 1963. Satmar Hasidim sort of caught on to this and realized that maybe instead of sending one of their representatives, they might send a friend or relative of theirs to be the initial point of contact with potential sellers of land, and that's what happened in the early 1970s in the town of Monroe in Orange County, when a clean-shaven, non-observant Hungarian Jew who was the relative of the leading political associate of Rabbi Teitelbaum bought the first land that would become the terrain of Kiryas Joel, New York. This land purchase began in the early 1970s, followed by a hidden, surreptitious effort to build a development. What was hidden was not the building of the development, but rather who was overseeing it, namely Satmar Hasidic Jews coming up from Brooklyn on a daily basis to oversee the construction of this new settlement, this new development. They lived or conducted their work in a windowless bunker and had contacts with local contractors who were sworn to secrecy. In the summer of 1974, the first stage of the development was completed, and Satmar Hasidic Jews from Brooklyn began to move into this new community that was part of the existing town of Monroe. What happened almost from the beginning is that tensions over zoning arose between the new residents and officials of the town of Monroe. For example, when the town of Monroe established ordinances that zoned certain properties for a single-family home, they conjured up the image of a conventional, suburban, often white, nuclear family with a mother and father and 2 children. They did not have in mind a family of Hasidic Jews with maybe 8 to 12 children, and the brother and sister-in-law of one of the family members with another 8 or 10 children, which is what occurred in some instances. Nor did the zoning officials of the town of Monroe countenance the fact that garden apartments might have in them synagogues, ritual baths, study halls, and even schools. When the Hasidim moved in, they began to repurpose the apartments and single-family homes to fit the norms and customs of the community. And this immediately and constantly drew the ire, or at least the attention, and then the ire of Monroe town zoning authorities. What resulted was very considerable acrimony between the new arrivals and the members of the officials of the town of Monroe for 2 years, with threats of lawsuits going back and forth, until a compromise was made to carve out of the town of Monroe a self-standing village, which it turns out is relatively easy to create in the town, in the state of New York. You can see here on the right what it takes, a territory of 500 or more inhabitants, provided that the territory is not already part of a city or village. Pay attention. It could be part, in fact, it had to be part of a town, not a city or a village. And the territory can be no more than 5 square miles. Kiryas Joel was far less than 5 square miles, and it was decided to create out of the town of Monroe a self-standing village. And so when this proposition went through the various legal hurdles and was finally signed off by New York State Secretary of State Mario Cuomo in the winter of 1977, the self-described Shtetl was transformed into a village. What had been a private assembly of citizens now became a public corporation, a municipality. And this is what I mean by communitarianism from the bottom up. You have private property rights, right, that most fundamental liberal ideal, the ability to acquire private property, plus the capacity of the residents of that community to vote up their community and transform it from a shtetl into a village. And that's what created the village of Kiryas Joel. Now, we might say that this is a complete outlier in the history of the United States. But I would suggest that what we're referring to here, which is a particular variant of communitarianism, what we might call religious communitarianism, is actually quite normative in the United States, extending back to Plymouth Rock, to the arrival of the Puritans, who came in order to create kind of self-standing religious community. And I think we can see throughout the history of the United States many attempts by religious communities to establish a place under the sun for their followers. Sometimes assuming the form of governmental authority in what would be the most, I think, extensive and celebrated instance, the state of Utah, which really emerged out of the efforts of Mormons to mix their religious community with the authority of state in Utah. So Kiryas Joel, in this regard, I would say, is a manifestly American phenomenon. Quite by contrast, it's almost without precedent in the annals of the Jews, with the exception, of course, of the state of Israel, which is a very strong form of sovereignty. But we don't have many instances in Europe whence the Satmar Hasidim came of self-standing religious communities that assume the power of governmental authority, as we saw in the case of Kiryas Joel. Now, in many regards, Kiryas Joel is not only an American phenomenon, but a decidedly successful enclave by the standards of enclave societies. It is, for example, homogeneous, which is indeed an ideal. This is not a community that welcomes outsiders. It is a community that believes, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, when a very large percentage of followers of Rabbi Teitelbaum were killed, it believes that it has a kind of right, an entitlement, to live according to its own norms. And by the way, it justifies this as consistent with the American tradition of cultural pluralism. Groups should be allowed to live as they see fit, provided that they abide by the rules of the state. It's a success in terms of education. There's an extensive system of private Jewish schools which teaches students from age 3 up to what we might call postgraduate studies. Curiously, while education is an extraordinarily important, indeed even sacred ideal within the community, very few members of the community have a college education, which is quite at odds with the typical profile of American Jews at large, who have a very high percentage of college attendance and graduation. Less than 8% of the population of Kiryas Joel have a bachelor's degree. And indeed, resistance to college study is an important preservative mechanism within the community. Education is valued, but not secular education. Language, 92%, according to the 2010 census, declare that a language other than English is the language spoken at home, which is to say more than 90% speak Yiddish at home. This is a community that functions from cradle to grave 24 hours a day in Yiddish, to the point that adult men who make their way out into the world are often at a very significant disadvantage because they sometimes do not command functional English. Women are different because they are exposed to more secular studies, including English, at a younger age. But this commitment to holding on to Yiddish is another preservative mechanism within the community. Modesty norms, yet another important form of, in a certain sense, success of the community in defining itself according to its own terms. Here you can see on the bottom right an oft-publicized sign greeting visitors who make their way to the community, which urges them to adhere to the modesty standards of the community. The growth of Kiryas Joel is another instance of its success. It doubles in population, as I said, every decade, and estimates are that in the year 2035 there will be 73,000 residents of Kiryas Joel if current rates of population current rates of population growth continue. Within a relatively short period of time, we're talking about a Hasidic city that will be over 100,000 residents. A Hasidic village, as it currently is, operates with its own mayor, village board, and school district, which I'll get to in just a second. Public school district. In addition to the very extensive network of private schools, there's also a public school district in Kiryas Joel. How was this enabled? It wasn't simply, well, it may have been simply divine intervention. That's a thesis I can neither confirm nor deny. What we also know that it's a function of is intense political engagement, which would seem to belie the quietism that the community often presents itself as embodying, and certainly the segregationist impulse. Segregationists, yes, but very committed to political engagement with secular authorities. And there's a long roll of photographs that I could present to you of Satmar Hasidic leaders meeting with secular political officials, extending back to this iconic picture on the left of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum greeting the Romanian king, King Karoli, in 1936. The middle, the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum meeting New York Mayor Robert Wagner, and on the right, one of the successors to Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum meeting with Governor Andrew Cuomo. So this success that I just referred to is in no small part a function of the commitment to political engagement of the community, really from its European roots. All right, but there are threats to the success of the community, and they have been substantial. The first was the passing in 1979 of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, the charismatic, all-powerful leader of the community, who left no heirs behind him. And thus, what emerged was a battle over succession that continues to this day. One of the interesting features of this battle over succession in its early years was that his wife, known as the Rebbitzin, Alta Feiga, became her own center of power in an entirely male-dominated world. She was the cohesive agent who held together the truest believers of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. Others said, we have to move on and find another leader, and another leader was found, the nephew of Rabbi Teitelbaum, namely Rabbi Moshe or Moses Teitelbaum, but a small band of followers followed the Rebbitzin and became known as the Bnei Joel, the sons of Joel, the most steadfast and ferociously steadfast group committed to the legacy of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. So almost immediately after his death, we see new fissures emerging that really crack open the image of communal solidarity that one might impute to this community, which is represented in this picture taken from Rabbi Teitelbaum's funeral. Another very important source of division was over the aforementioned public school district. At a certain point in time, in the mid-1980s, some residents of Kiryas Joel realized that they were not receiving adequate services for their special needs children. And they explored a number of options, none of which panned out, which ultimately led to the idea that a public school district be created in Kiryas Joel to attend to the needs of the special needs kids. This produced its own ferocious resistance within the community. And in a certain sense, that combative quality of Rabbi Teitelbaum was transmitted to his followers, and in the mid-1980s was then turned inward as one group squared off against the other. Some advocated the creation of a public school to attend to the special needs kids. Others said that this was a kind of Trojan horse that would entail the importation of foreign values that would undo the very fabric of society. These fissures were exacerbated even further when Rabbi Moses Teitelbaum, the second Satmar Rebbe, decided to, in a certain sense, divide what we might call the Satmar kingdom, one center of which was in Williamsburg in northern Brooklyn, where Rabbi Teitelbaum first settled, and the other was in Kiryas Joel. He designated each of two sons to be the chief authority in those two realms. And immediately, tensions broke out, acrimony rose, and stark divisions between followers of the two brothers characterized the community, infiltrated each of the other's community. Initially, the followers of Rabbi Zalman Leib, who was based in Brooklyn, were very minimally represented in Kiryas Joel, and the same was true of Rabbi Aaron, who was based in Kiryas Joel. He had relatively few followers in Williamsburg. Today, in Kiryas Joel, it's estimated that followers of the Williamsburg rabbi are anywhere from 40 to 55% of the population, which one very astute observer notes makes Kiryas Joel a two-party system. Now, this is very interesting and instructive because nothing would seem more American than the ideal of a two-party system. We often think of Kiryas Joel as a foreign importation, as decidedly other, but part of what I want to argue is that Kiryas Joel is in many ways manifestly American. And in fact, even in the midst of its of its separatist resistance to foreign cultural values, there is a steady stream of assimilatory, particularly political norms that make their way into the community, in part enabled by that tradition of political accommodation that I mentioned to you. So intense, I should add, are the divisions within the community that not only did some residents of Kiryas Joel oppose the creation of a public school district, in a court case that made its way to the United States Supreme Court in 1994. But, as you can see on the right, some members of the community actually called for the dissolution of Kiryas Joel, arguing that it was a violation of the separation of church and state. So, when we think of this community, we can see a number of defining tensions that lend it certainly a strong dose of vibrancy and vitality. There is internal dissension that was restrained until the death of the founding rabbi, Joel Teitelbaum, in 1979. Very pronounced internal tension that is manifested in opposition between the two main groups, followers of Rabbi Aaron and followers of Rabbi Zalman Leib, with the addition of the B'nai Yol, or the B'nai Yol as they're called, the most stringently observant sons of Joel. There are very stark tensions between Kiryas Joel as a political entity and its surrounding neighbors, who regard it as ceaselessly appetitive, constantly consuming more and more natural resources, including land and water, the two most important. And I should say that in very recent times, over the last year or so, the idea has arisen, now supported by the mainstream faction in Kiryas Joel, the dissidents in Kiryas Joel, to a great extent, and the opposition group outside of the community in the town of Monroe, known as United Monroe, that Kiryas Joel should at long last secede from the town of Monroe and become a formally recognized town, which is a step towards becoming ultimately a city. That's an important tension between Kiryas Joel and its neighbors. There's also, of course, a theoretical tension that I've alluded to in passing, which inheres, I think, in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which calls for the following: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, there's a certain tension inhering in this formulation itself. Kiryas Joel would not have been enabled were it not for the principle of the free exercise of religion. You can follow any religious creed you want in this country. And for that matter, if you're a private citizen, you're entitled to the right to buy private property. Were there an established church in the United States, it may be the case that a community like Kiryas Joel would not be allowed to take rise. Certainly in Europe, when you had established state religions, you also had established Jewish communities from which one could not secede very easily. So in a certain sense, the First Amendment, both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, enabled the growth of Kiryas Joel. But at the same time, Kiryas Joel, by virtue of the permeable boundary between religious and political authority, would seem to be an instance of the establishment of religion. Again, this is not unknown in the annals of the United States. Again, if we return to the example of Mormons in America, we recall readily not just the state of Utah, but two cities under the control of a breakaway Mormon sect that remained committed to plural marriage on the border between Utah and Arizona, Colorado City and Hildale, located on the border, adjoined communities committed to plural marriage, where almost all of the town officialdom, including the police, operated under the control of charismatic sect leaders. Curiously, but not surprisingly, this community or set of communities caught the attention of federal authorities who were notified by dissidents within this dissident community, which found the towns guilty of religious discrimination and imposed penalties on the two Mormon communities, which suggests to us constraints on local sovereignty in instances of religious communitarianism. In thinking of Kiryas Joel, I want to move towards conclusion. We should note a really, I think, paramount defining tension, which is between the high birth rate, which continues to add to the demographic roles of the community, on one hand, and the ultimate danger in the eyes of every communal official, and for that matter, virtually every adult in the community, which is the internet. The internet, which really collapses the very boundaries that Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum so assiduously sought to establish. And indeed, there's a great deal of concern and even panic over the capacity of the internet to expose, especially young people in the community, to realms of knowledge that are deemed not just unnecessary, but extremely dangerous. What you see before you are, on the right side, 3 examples of books written by people who left traditional observant communities such as Kiryas Joel, including perhaps one of the most famous of them, called Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman, who lived in both Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel. Final thoughts. Kiryas Joel, which is a wholly Satmar Hasidic community, is also a decidedly American phenomenon in both counterintuitive and intuitive ways. It's a clear instance of communitarianism from the bottom up that was enabled by the free exercise of religion, but also by a decidedly American phenomenon, which is the skillful play of interest group politics. Some people say these people are connivers who are exploitative and manipulative. We can talk about that, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that they play, according to the rules of the game, pretty well. If you can assemble the necessary votes in your district, you can exert very considerable influence over the way in which your community operates. And this, I think, finally reveals a curious feature of a liberal system such as the American system. And I mean liberal both in terms of political sensibility, but also in the economic sense, in terms of the acquisition of private property, which was also a key enabling force in the creation of Kiryas Joel. Here we see how liberalism allows for the creation of decidedly illiberal forms, which many in Kiryas Joel would readily and proudly acknowledge, to take rise and flourish, often justified in the name of cultural diversity. And with that, I will conclude. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
We'll now be starting the question and answer portion. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Either Isabella or I will come to you. As always, priority goes to students.
Hi, thank you so much for your app talk. I learned a lot from this. My question has to do with, you mentioned earlier in your talk how women were more exposed to the English language, and it was less of an issue for them when they went out into the real world, like knowing English, and I was just wondering why that was.
Because of the patriarchal and male-dominated tradition of learning within a traditional Jewish community like Kiryas Joel, which is to say that men and boys are the ones upon whom it is believed there is an obligation to engage in the study of the Talmud and rabbinic commentaries, and to do so throughout their lives. There's a far lower value placed on secular studies, which has led to the rise of organizations of people who left communities such as Kiryas Joel, seeking some measure of justice because they feel they were deprived of basic skills that would enable them to fend for themselves in the world. So, to go back, there's a value, extraordinarily high value placed on boys and men studying the traditional diet of rabbinic law. Women are not held to that same obligation, and therefore are exposed to a much higher percentage of secular studies, including English and some forms of English literature. This makes women much more functional in English, and in a certain sense more worldly. Now, cutting against that is the fact that women in Kiryas Joel do not drive. Women in Kiryas Joel do not drive. And it is more commonly the men who leave the community to commute to New York or New Jersey to engage in economic pursuits. So we have these vectors moving in opposite directions in terms of the status of women. This is a world of separate spheres in a very profound way. Men assume a very considerable portion of the public sphere. It is an ideal within the Hasidic world that women are the custodians of the private or domestic sphere. All of that is seen as consistent with the prescribed gender norms of this traditional community.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was actually curious to hear from you how the community of Kiryas Joel has reacted to your work. Are they responsive, positively or negatively? And kind of, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's funny, I'm an historian, and I typically study decidedly dead white men. This is a very different experience. This is living history. This is ethnography. This is encountering human subjects, as the IRB review would have it, in all of their complexity. I first wrote a letter to the school superintendent of the community 15 years ago and asked if I could come and study the community. And I expected to receive an immediate answer, or for that matter, an immediate answer no, or no answer at all. And instead, I received an answer after a relatively brief period of time. Yes, please do come into the community. Please do study us. We believe that after 35 years, it is time for someone to hold up a mirror so that we can see how we appear. Which again, I think is one of the interesting indicators of the extent to which this community has become Americanized. That sort of desire to see how not only the community observes itself, but how outsiders observe it. And from that time, I have been surprised almost always by how open and receptive people are. People ask, what are Satmar Hasidim like? And I say, they're funny, they're smart, they're curious, or less so, just like people. People are people. And so are Satmar Hasidim. That said, I have to say that my own research efforts have been considerably enhanced by the existence of that succession battle, because each side wants to make sure that I get it right. And they always ask, whom did you talk to last? And when I tell them, they say, okay, sit down, and now I'm going to tell you how it really is. Very commonly, the folks that I meet with are not great at prearranging meetings. And when I'm coming from Los Angeles, that's a major inconvenience. Typically, I'll get to New York and people will tell me, give me a call, tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And I'll give a call tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and they say, all right, I'm free between 1 and 1:30 in 2 hours, 3 hours. I'll speed up and think, I have to really cram a lot in. 3 hours later, I'm like slumped in a corner as they've entered, just the beginning of the story. They want to make sure I understand the full complexity of the story, and people have been, in that regard, very expansive in telling me how the community unfolded and why their position is right. I should say I've also found people to be really almost unfailingly pleasant and hospitable in my experience, and immensely likable. I should just tell you a little bit. One of my recent visits, I was exposed to elements of the community that I hadn't really seen as a group before. These were the free thinkers in Kiryas Joel, a tightly regulated, richly stringent community. These were the people who, while visibly indistinguishable from anyone else in the community, made frequent use of the internet, toyed with the idea of leaving, lived in a certain sense in a mental world that was deeply dissonant with their physical reality. They also happened to be in large percentage pot smokers, it turned out, which was a real surprise to me, I have to say. And just reminded me that within even a seemingly homogeneous enclave society, there's a remarkable degree of diversity. And that is instructive and revealing to me on a daily basis whenever I go to visit this community, which has been shockingly receptive to me.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the conflict between the state and federal system and the township or the village of Kiryas Joel, just to the extent that it seems like there must be very clear violations of what would be normally federal and state laws in terms of discrimination, or maybe not, but I'm wondering what keeps the conflict from rising to a more public level.
Yeah, there are actually remarkably few instances of legal battles between state and federal officials on one hand and the community, which I think has to do with two things. One, the savvy of the community in knowing what the rules are and how to use them to their advantage, and the political power of the community. Plain and simple. The complicating factor has been the rift over succession within the community, which has had the effect of diluting the power of the voting bloc. But in some instances that's true, and in some instances there's total alignment, especially with respect to some state and federal officials. What there has been, there's not been an excessive amount of legal action threatened or taken against the village per se. What there have been instances of fraud against individual members of the community or groups of members in the community acting in a private capacity. And that relates, I think, to what is for some a different set of ethical norms when one deals with members of one's own community as opposed to when one deals with the outside Gentile world. So there have been a number of high-profile fraud cases brought against members of the Kiryas Joel community over the years that some would say reflect, a complete state of moral corruption in terms of business ethics, which I don't think is true. There's also a lingering suspicion that there's an extraordinarily high level of welfare fraud. Kiryas Joel, it's important to note, is, according to the 2010 census, the poorest community in America, with a rate of poverty hovering around 60%. 60% of the community dwells below the poverty line. Now, it's important to note that what that means is if you have 10 or 12 kids and earn $50,000 to $60,000, you're considered at or below the poverty line. What's also the case is that, A, there's no discernible trace of poverty as one might see in other poverty-stricken communities. And there is both very substantial state and federal support, in a certain sense, the flip side of your question, owing to the political power of Kiryas Joel, and also a very extensive private social service network, such that hunger and homelessness are unknown in this community.
Can you just say what the political power is as it relates to the outside world of Kiryas Joel? What do they exert?
They elect officials. They elect officials who represent their interests. They elect state assembly people, state senators, congresspeople, and are thought to exert a large effect on state elections generally, which leads, I have to just say, to some very interesting and sometimes humorous encounters. In the world of micro-voting, if you can carry a district with 90% of the vote, that can be dispositive in an election. So you might say, well, we're only talking about 10 or 15,000 people, but in sort of the analytics of election campaigning, that can be extremely important. So I'll tell you just a very brief, funny story about an encounter between Satmar Hasidim remember, archly anti-Zionist, and then Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, who called down the leaders of the community to try to recruit them to support the campaign of a man running for United States Senate in New York by the name of Rick Lazio, happened to be running against Hillary Clinton. And Trent Lott attempted to use his Southern charm to encourage this group of Satmar Hasidim to get behind Rick Lazio. Now, if Satmar Hasidic political officials are anything, they're very savvy. They know, which horse to bet on to serve their interests very often. And Trent Lott said, in his Southern drawl, now, if you boys vote for, get behind Rick Lazio, I promise you that I will support the state of Israel until my dying day. And this was told to me by someone who was at the meeting, who told it to me with an appropriate set of ironic humor. He said, we sort of get it, we sort of get how we might be mistaken for some others within the Jewish community.
Thank you for your talk. I'm from New York and didn't even know Kiryas Joel existed, so very interesting on that end. And my expectation for this answer changed a bit with your last two, but what do you think the future holds for Kiryas Joel if they do become a town? Will they be able to operate on their own with their resources that they would have as a town, or is being part of this larger community of Monroe really what's keeping them alive? Or is they just a utopia that can't really exist on their own, and even with the big population growth would just come down in the future?
Yeah, so I think the question is, will it be able to sustain itself? Well, it certainly will be able to sustain itself at its current rate of poverty, right? The question is, can it creep out of that and lower the rate of poverty? And I think the answer is likely to be yes. There are growing patterns of affluence within the community, which, by the way, has to do with very successful entrepreneurs and business people who are making their way out of the community, which, of course, opens up the prospect of the disintegration of that intense separatist sensibility. So you have these seemingly countervailing vectors at work, right? Sort of the outflow to the world beyond Kiryas Joel to achieve economic affluence, which enables, at one level, in the immediate sense, the growth of institutions within the community, but may also lead to a different kind of appetite for residents of the community. Just in demographic terms, the community is growing at a rapid clip. Outflow, such as is reflected in these books on the right, is very small. The pain of leaving such a holistic, all-consuming community is enormous. The psychic pain is enormous. That said, I think it's very hard to predict the capacity of the community to continue to grow in exactly the same way that it has in an internet era. It's, I think, going to be very difficult to retain that same sense of insularity in the internet era. And my suspicion is that when Kiryas Joel becomes a town, and as it continues to grow, and as internet use expands, what is likely to happen is that other traditionally observant individuals or groups will begin to move into the community because it can provide basic services. And my sense is that in the next quarter century or so, it will grow demographically while the percentage of Satmar Hasidim declines, and ultimately may become more of a haven for Orthodox Jews in a more generic sense, which will make it a very different kind of community, because there is this very characteristically Satmar willingness to engage in battle in order to achieve one's ends that drives forward, I think, that political audacity that has enabled this community to grow as it has. There's a precursor to Kiryas Joel called New Square, which was established in 1961 by Skver Hasidim, another Hasidic group. And they don't have the kind of political chutzpah or audacity or imperial vision of Satmar Hasidim. And they've maintained largely the same population, I mean, within the confines of a rapidly expanding, of a high birth rate, but have also maintained themselves off the radar. Satmar Hasidim have a kind of political audacity that I think has enabled their success. That may diminish as the community grows and more people come in.
Thanks again for your talk. I was just wondering if you could speak to the experiences of people you've talked to who have successfully left the community and what the kickback for them was.
Well, success is defined variously. No one regards it as an unequivocal success to leave. Everyone is marked by deep, deep emotional wounds, because to leave often means to leave behind one's family. Sometimes it means to leave behind one's children. One of the features of the community is that local, which is to say state family courts, very often take quite literally the orders of custody arrangements that rabbinical courts have laid down. Local judges are elected by residents of the town of Monroe, an overwhelming percentage of whose voters are Satmar Hasidim. Custody arrangements can oftentimes be very, very difficult, and I know of more than a few instances of people who leave the community and there's a near total rupture with their family and sometimes even with their own children. It's also very difficult for many who leave the community, for most who leave the community, to make any sense of what the outside world is like when they leave. It's not at all surprising that a sadly high proportion, especially of men who leave, make their way to some form or another of substance abuse. Learning the ways of the world, even for girls who know English and have been reading English literature, is very challenging. There are a number of organizations that have taken rise in order to assist people who leave in making the transition to the outside world. At the same time, it's interesting to hear the stories of what it is that sort of lit that spark of rebellion. For some, in the pre-internet era, it was reading. It was exposure to literature, which initially was very circumscribed and then might well have led to surreptitious visits to the town of Monroe Library, which certainly would have brought down upon it corporal punishment if discovered. Sometimes one just had sort of innately rebellious people who said, I can't live this way. This is not who I was meant to be. So there are different stories told about what lit that spark. But in almost every instance that I know of, the pain of leaving has been great, and there is at some level, even as someone is fully out, a sense that part of that person's soul remains back in the community. So holistic and organic is that community.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have tonight. Please join me in once again thanking our speaker, and just